Hello everyone, welcome to the Dome9 webinar. My name is Thelen Blum and I'll be your host today for the webinar Accelerate Your CI/CD Pipeline with Hardened Security and Compliance Prior to Deployment. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We will close with Q&A at the end of the session. If you would like to ask a question, please type the question in the window of GoToWebinar, and Patrick will address as many questions as possible, time permitting. We also have 3 handouts today. The first one is a copy of the Dome9 ARC product brief. The second is a copy of the Dome9 Compliance and Governance product brief. And the third is the Dome9 DevOps Solution Brief. Please feel free to download this content at any time during the webinar. Our webinar today will be hosted by Patrick Pusher, our Director of Customer Advocacy at Dome9. And before we get started, I wanted to give you a little background on Patrick. Patrick is focused here on building an active and engaged customer community around cloud security best practices in the Dome9 ARC platform. Patrick brings over 2 decades of on-hands experience in technology and has paved the way for cloud computing, virtualization, automation, agile software development, DevSecOps, and infrastructure as code. His passion is in educating customers around how to achieve the agility promised by infrastructure as a service while remaining secure. He regularly meets with customers, presents at conferences, contributes to cloud community initiatives and testing certification programs, and drives online discussions to build engagement. Launching into our webinar discussion today, infrastructure as code has emerged as an essential element of an organization's DevOps practices. Tools such as AWS Cloud Formation templates allow software-defined infrastructure to be deployed quickly and repeatedly to AWS. But the agility of the CI/CD pipeline also creates new challenges in infrastructure security hardening. How do you ensure that your CFTs meet your organization's security, compliance, and governance needs before you deploy them? How do you deploy infrastructure securely to production environments and monitor the security posture on a continuous basis? And how do you do this repeatedly without hitting a speed bump? In the 60-minute webinar, Patrick will provide a foundation for how to bring proven software hardening practices into the world of infrastructure deployment. He will discuss how Dome9 support of CFTs enable organizations to incorporate security and compliance prior to deployment in live environments and accelerate your CI/CD pipeline by up to 50% for a faster time to market. Without further ado, I will now pass the ball to Patrick. Let's get started.
Thank you, Thelen. And welcome everybody. Thank you so much for about the next 45 to 50 minutes of your attention. As Thelen suggests, today we're going to be talking about really building security into any automated process that you may have inside your organization, right? We're talking a little bit about continuous integration and continuous delivery, and a lot of our examples that we speak about this morning will be focused there, but it's really about finding a security solution that integrates really into your workflow, rather than having to create new workflow, for any sort of tooling that you might standardize on in the way of security visibility and automation. So with that said, let's get started. Maybe before we dive into the real meat of our presentation today, let's talk about the 3 types of users, the 3 personas that find the most value in a tool set and a solution like Dome9. First, we have security operations or SecOps, and it's really, these folks are most interested in being alerted to events that compromise the state of your security controls, right? Having all the information quickly at hand to understand these changes and how to fix them. Governance, risk, and compliance teams are interested in establishing a baseline config whereby infrastructure is judged on a continuous basis, right? This baseline can be dictated in the form of regulation that an organization, must adhere to, or it can be more best practice driven and proprietary. And then lastly, and really the focus of our discussion today is DevOps, right? They're interested in building security into a process to ensure that what gets provisioned consistently meets the goals of the organization, right? Things move very fast in an automated world, especially for software publishers, and leaving security to a manual process is really a non-starter for this group. It really must be inherent in all that they do, and we'll talk about the reasons why very shortly. So the move to paradigms like continuous integration and continuous delivery really began with the rise of popularity of the agile software development methodology, right? Once we moved from big monolithic software releases, often published as boxed products and shipped to physical stores, to much smaller incremental software releases on a more continual basis, and we shifted to deliver this software in many cases as a service, that really demanded new perspectives on how we consume and control infrastructure. And then right behind that, how we manage security in this new paradigm. So it's those organizations then that can marry together that agile software methodology with an infrastructure that can respond at the rate of change that they require, and that will find ultimate success in their pursuit of efficiency. So DevOps then, sort of by definition, is the intersection of software development and infrastructure operations that result most often in a unique blend of automation and integration to enable a mix of development, testing, QA, and release teams to be part of a single approach to problem solving. Right? With DevOps, we break down the functional silos between these groups and view them as one, while we integrate the output of one process to the input of the next. What often gets considered last, or sometimes not at all, unfortunately, in this process is security. So why do we bother? Well, when we think about the manual software release paradigm, it is fraught with challenge, right? Right from the start, we rely on people rather than automation, which of course the people rely on something to guide them, documentation, and just that alone, kind of this, making sure that the documentation represents the current state of infrastructure in a very rapidly changing, highly dynamic environment is a challenge enough itself. But then as we kind of walk down that process, we find that it becomes, frankly, unmanageable at scale, right? If you're doing a software release or two a year, maybe this is okay, but the whole idea behind continuous integration, continuous delivery is that we can make small changes without having to follow this, very sort of heavy process, right? If we have a quick bug fix to do, we have confidence that we have the automation built, we have confidence that the testing is being done reliably the same time every time, and lastly, the confidence that the software we're pushing out is being done in a secure way that meets the expectations of our organizational IT. What really happens when we leave this to a manual process is that the speed of business kind of takes priority, and security becomes a second, if not a very distant kind of consideration in lieu of just getting the software product out there on time. And I think when we trust this to automation, we get around a lot of these compromises that we make kind of by hand as we get people involved. So this is why we focus on on building security into a process and having it done reliably every time. So when we architect our development environment process to be more agile, but we leave security out of the discussion, we wind up in a state where we do security validation at the very end of the process, right, just before we deploy our solution. The challenge with this is that the investment in time that the process has already consumed, right? Wouldn't we want to know much earlier in the process, if possible, that our software, our solution failed our internal security checks? Of course we would. It's one of Agile's main tenets, really. Fail fast so you can course correct and get it right, rather than invest time in this process and just find out at the end that you have a failure, maybe based on security. So once again, security becomes that red-headed stepchild, if you will, that's viewed as something that's an organization must do, rather than considering security, or maybe more precisely, new security tools and capabilities as an enabler of new capability, for example. So in comparison to that traditional and siloed approach, we see that rugged DevOps or automated processes integrate securely into each step of the software development lifecycle by leveraging automation and integration between technologies. We need automation methods to understand if, when, how changes to our environment deviate from our desired state. And from a people perspective, we also integrate security staff, engineering, and operations together for a unified and always current perspective on infrastructure needs versus security visibility and enforcement. So Dome9 is a SaaS-delivered security orchestration platform that can be used both interactively but also pragmatically and in a heavily automated fashion via the Dome9 API. Dome9 is no different in this regard than cloud providers themselves. Anything you can do at the interactive console, you can also accomplish with via API with Dome9, with a few well understood exceptions, and we'll get into those within the demo portion. The platform is purpose-built this way to fit the need of those migrating from a traditional data center environment, maybe, where automation is modest and will heavily lean on the AWS console, all the way to those already heavily invested in the AWS API or really any cloud provider API in the way of automating their infrastructure needs. And they need tooling to fit into an already established workflow or process. The Dome9 ARC family stands for Assess, Remediate, and Control, the three pillars of functionality really within the platform. We have tools and perspectives to dive deep into either live cloud networking scenarios or to infrastructure as code to assess your security posture even before you think about provisioning. Right? Once understood, Dome9 has the capability in line to also fix problems identified by this new visibility without even leaving the tool, and then the ability to enforce the correct configuration going forward and to regularly and continuously assess your overall security posture compared to any desired baseline, even a very, very customized one. So today, in this webinar, we'll be speaking about just a few of the Dome9 capabilities that really speak to this heavily automated management of your security posture, but where there are many related features within Dome9 ARC that we won't talk about today. From IAM security to policy reports, each Dome9 feature plays a part in increasing your level of visibility into the detail you need to make informed security decisions. So think of the capabilities we'll speak of shortly as part of a bigger family that deliver this visibility and control required to scale your security alongside the rest of your cloud efforts. But just before we go there, let's close on what development and a release process with integrated security might look like. Right? So first, validating your security and compliance posture early in the process. We talked about why this is important already. The earlier the better, so we don't invest this time into sort of a stale or dead process. We do this in two ways, right? One with Dome9 Clarity, where we can evaluate a Visio diagram-like fashion where traffic can and perhaps more importantly cannot flow within a given cloud network. So Clarity is one example of these interactive tools that does not have API coverage. I think why you'll see in a moment. It truly is kind of an interactive tool, but it takes a CloudFormation template as input. So you can judge live infrastructure, or you can judge that infrastructure as code. No more full-time open network security ports to accommodate the software deployment process. So using Dome9, I'll show you how to keep your closed by default security posture, but still enable the push of software through the software development lifecycle. And if you're tired of alerts from so-called automation software that don't make sense for your organization, maybe there's too many assumptions or they're just too generic, we'll show you how to focus in on exactly what's important to you and only what's important to you via Dome9's compliance and governance feature set. So if we think about a CI/CD kind of process that has security baked into it, we come up with something like this, where we begin to design our intended change. Maybe it's a new application, maybe it's an update to an application. We begin to design that, and we do so in a format that our cloud platform support. And most often within Amazon Web Services, we do this with CloudFormation templates. So the change we're about to make in our production environment, we begin to express as code by the way of CloudFormation templates. And so we use Dome9 to validate those, both using a tool we have called Clarity, which we've referenced once already. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment, but then also with the Dome9 compliance engine. Right, the compliance engine can judge live infrastructure just as well as it can judge this infrastructure as code via CloudFormation. Once we're done, we provision that into our staging environment. We do some automated testing, regression testing, that sort of thing. Then once that passes successfully, we provision into production. And then there's one final test that Dome9 does here initially in this process, and that's just to make sure that nothing in the way of undocumented changes has snuck in between when we tested your intent versus when we test what's actually been provisioned live in your environment. So comparing the results of these two tests kind of solidifies this process and gives us additional confidence that we have followed our organizational IT governance policy. And then once that's done, of course, to continuously enforce that policy going forward. It's one thing to judge the change that we're about to make, to judge the change that we just made, but then, of course, we have to handle the life cycle of ensuring there is no configuration drift over time. And so Dome9 can help you in all three areas. And so we're going to talk primarily about three features. First one being Dome9 Clarity. And again, Clarity is your sort of Visio-like diagram map of all of the traffic possibilities in any given cloud network. And this is often the first step in terms of analyzing infrastructure as code. I'll show you how you can look at live environments, plus how you can upload CloudFormation templates and get the very same sort of visual experience of both. Next, we'll look at the Dome9 compliance engine, which is the exact same case, the ability to judge an existing environment within any cloud account you have connected to Dome9, but also to judge CloudFormation templates against the very same criteria. And that's an important point as well, right? We can take maybe you're governed by PCI regulation, right? You can judge your CloudFormation template for suitability of that spec. You can judge your newly provisioned environment, and then, as we suggested in a slide just a couple ago, we can also then continuously make sure we're measuring for any deviances that maybe drive us further away from that regulated policy. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about dynamic access leasing. This is a feature that allows you to keep a network port closed full-time and only open it on demand for a time-limited period, both for users but also for process. And I think it's the process side that's interesting to our discussion today, right? If I am publishing software to a workload that is normally closed to the public, right? I don't want to necessarily have to create a full-time open network port to enable that software push. Using Dome9 Dynamic Access Leasing, I can keep it closed. I can open it just for that software push event. Once it's done, I can reclose it, and all of this becomes audited events within Dome9, right? So very easy to report on, when was a port opened, when was it closed, what was the purpose, these kinds of things. So we'll talk about that as well. With that, let me move over to the product portion. One moment. Okay, welcome to your Dome9 dashboard. If you're new to Dome9, this is the first time you've seen this. If not, this is familiar. Let's first focus, in order of the slides we went over, around Clarity. Now, Clarity, again, is the ability to take any given cloud network, and this works across cloud providers. So this works the same as it does in AWS, in Azure, and in Google Cloud. But we're also going to focus on the ability to upload a CloudFormation template. So let me show you what this looks like in a live environment kind of way, and then we'll talk about how CloudFormation templates are supported. So if I pick an AWS account, and then I pick an AWS region, and of course these are things you wouldn't pick if you were uploading a CloudFormation template, we get a view of all of the VPCs in this network. Now, this is probably very small. Let me zoom this up for you. So we have a couple kind of hub and spoke looking architectures here. What these lines tell you is that each VPC is peered, right? So for some reason, there is a VPC peering relationship between each of these networks and a common one. Even in the case where you've got maybe this VPC peering relationship is across an AWS account that Dome9 does not have a presence in. This is kind of an interesting shadow IT kind of detection tool where I might see this unmanaged, meaning, okay, there's another AWS account where Dome9 has no visibility into that's created a peering relationship with the VPC in this account. Perhaps this is a shadow IT kind of activity because, let's be honest, infrastructure without data isn't all that fun. Perhaps something was set up and then this peering relationship was set up with your corporate network to gain access to the data. Clarity will tell you that. But the idea here is to pick a given network, and for our case, we'll pick this one, and we'll choose Security Group View. Now, this is the same view you get as you upload a CloudFormation template. And really what you're going to be looking at are distinct security groups. That's what you see on the screen here. And they're ranked into one of 4 swim lanes. So DMZ, partially open, effectively internal, or internal zone. And the security groups are ranked here automatically by Dome9. We should mention that there is no use of agents or appliances within the data you see here, right? You connect your cloud accounts to Dome9 via a role and a policy, and then once that is established, Dome9 uses that role in a cross-account kind of way to understand your infrastructure. So illustrations like this can be obtained, within 30 minutes of signing up with a Dome9 account. No software to install. And really what you're looking at are, again, distinct AWS security groups ranked in this port exposure kind of way. The reason that I have my default security group, for example, out here in the DMZ, is it has one or more very, very permissive network security rules. And to know which ones those are, you can look in the right-hand detail pane, and we'll highlight the very permissive rules in red. So it's this SSH from anywhere in the world rule that categorizes default in the DMZ. So Clarity is very good at capturing this, right? If you upload a CloudFormation template, for example, that's got your database tier over here in the DMZ because it's got some very permissive rules, you know right away that you've got a design problem, right? From a security context, you have an issue. That's much harder to judge once you've provisioned in an interface like this. The AWS console is very, very good at control. It's less good at contextual understanding. Right? If I'm going through my distinct security groups, trying to understand the rule sets of each, how do I understand how they relate to each other in an overall way? Right? That is the design principle of Clarity, whether you're pointing it at live environments or CloudFormation templates. The intent's the same. Make sure I understand what's out here on the edge of my network, accepting relatively broad traffic, versus what's tucked nice and neatly back here in my internal zone. Things like my database server tier should always be here. There's no need to have my database server tier open to the world at all, never mind very permissively. It should really only see the tier of my app like the web tier, like the monitoring tier. It should really only have rules in its security group to do with those and not with the internet at large, of course. Although we've seen many security events, let's call them this year, where that isn't the case, where the database tier is wide open to the public. And that's the kind of problem that Clarity is very well built to solve. When you're using Clarity in a live environment, you have a few more controls available to you than when you upload a CloudFormation template. And as I talk about it, I'm sure you'll understand why. So we have the ability to overlay actual traffic-related information supplied to us by AWS VPC flow logs. So this is for networks that exist that have traffic hitting them at any given time. If I turn this on, this allows me to work through actual traffic-related stats, right? And I can take this, I can export it to CSV, I can work with it within the platform itself. I can gain some additional information around the geolocation of IP addresses that are consuming my resources or that are being rejected by my firewall rule set, right? I have all that ability. So that's Clarity. There are certainly more views to it, but that's the intent of Clarity. And again, on the way in, you either choose a network or you upload a CloudFormation template. And really, the experience is the same from that point, right? So if you have a CloudFormation template, upload it to Dome9, the interface looks like that. Pick it from your file system, and away you go. So that's clarity, and that's often the first stop in the use of DOM 9 in this sort of pragmatic, process-driven way, right? We express our intent in a CloudFormation template. Maybe we do some security peer review. We pass it to DOM 9 Clarity and make sure that all of our assumptions are correct and that we don't have any unintended network exposure. And then the next stop for that CFT is often in compliance. And DOM 9's take on compliance is one of either using one of the off-the-shelf, what we call rule bundles that we have built, and we have coverage for some formal data security standards like PCI, like HIPAA High-Tech, like NIST 853. We also have some less formal, more best practice-driven standards like CIS, even some best practices from AWS. So we have great either starting points, or if you want to use these in their entirety. But what most often DOM 9 customers do is they'll take one of these, they'll clone it, and once they do that, this bundle becomes user editable. And we have a language that we've developed called GSL, our governance specification language. And as you can see, each one of these rules, you can actually see the GSL syntax to do with them. GSL is intended to be near English readable. I think if you've used a competing compliance solution, even one inherent with the platforms we support themselves, if you're trying to write a test for something that isn't supported out of the box or by default, typically you are writing code, right? So you need a developer skill set, so you're writing code in a language like JavaScript, for example. And that process in itself takes the policy creator quite a ways away from the process itself, right? That policy creator has to lean on a developer or a team of developers to really interpret and implement the rule, meaning they're kind of one step removed from the process. And our goal is to get the policy creator much closer to the process. I mean, they can certainly understand these rules, if not author themselves. If they don't know the language all that well, if their maturity and experience with DOM 9 is minimal, we do have the ability to walk through and iterate on a rule. So, if you know the syntax, great, you can type it straight in. If you don't, we have what we call the rule builder. And we show you the kinds of entities we support across the platforms that we support. And so if I wanted to do something, very specific, something that I would never find in a pre-published data security standard, those standards don't know my naming conventions, they don't know my tagging standards. So if I wanted to do something very specific, I could do that. Let's start with something basic, right? An instance where any number of criteria, right, that exists in a certain region, that belongs to a certain account, that's tagged a certain way, that's public-facing, that is running versus is turned off. But let's say, in our case, tags, right? So where tags contain the key of, whatever, something relevant. So any instance that matches that condition should have inbound firewall rules that contain, actually, let's back this up a little bit. Not should have. Let's say should not have. Should not have inbound firewall rules that contain port equals 22. We're going to do a very similar rule to one we just saw, but with some specificity and a scope of anybody. Right, so not a real complicated rule, but we've added some specificity here in terms of, not measuring all instances, but measuring instances that meet certain criteria. Should not have inbound firewall rules, to do with port 22. I should probably put TCP port 22 in this rule, but port 22 and a scope of, the whole world. It's that easy to write a very specific rule for your environment, and this is what typically a lot of customers will do. They'll clone those bundles, and then they'll augment with these, naming standards, conditions, regional standards, however they use their cloud accounts to reduce the number of false positives, right? And I alluded to this back in the slide deck, where quite often, as we use pre-canned rules and pre-published rule sets in competing solutions, if we don't have the ability to easily customize them, we wind up with a lot of false positives. Using DOM 9 compliance, you can write rules that are very, very specific and just be confident that you're measuring exactly what you want to measure, instead of having 10 or 15 or 20 or 100 failures every time that aren't real failures, right? That you kind of have to do some mental gymnastics to understand why they're in your failure list. So if we go back, let's have a quick look at what a compliance engine assessment looks like. And you'll see right away that just like within Clarity, as I click Run Assessment, I have some options, right? I can run an assessment against a live account. I can run assessment against all of my accounts that I have connected to Dome9 at once. And I should mention that the largest Dome9 customers have hundreds of cloud accounts connected to their single Dome9 account. One of the value props of doing that is that all of those, all the security control states, all of the resources, even across multiple cloud vendors, are then kind of rolled up in a single interface. And I know it's a very abused term, but it gives you that single pane of glass to be able to understand exactly, making sure your policies that you are trying to enforce are consistent across not only all of your cloud accounts of one type, but across all of your multi-cloud initiatives as well. So you can do that, but you can also upload a CloudFormation template, just as you saw me show you within Clarity. So those are the two ways to do assessments. Now, unlike Clarity, this is also possible, and in fact, probably exercised the most via API. Right? You could do this in a one-off way, as you can see me do within the portal, but you can also drive this process by API. So you can take a CloudFormation template, send it to Dome9, have it judge, capture the results back, because then often what you're going to do is either compare those or store those for a future comparison, maybe against a live environment assessment at the end of the process, like we talked about in slide form earlier. So, there's lots and lots of capabilities that get exposed via that Dome9 API-driven compliance assessment. But so let's do this. Let's run this against a live account now, and we'll give you a feel for what the format of information coming back looks like. So we have an environment set up to have a nice mix of failures and passes, both kind of globally. Obviously, we failed more than we passed here, but then regionally as well, right? So kind of above this first half of the screen, this information is really intended for your compliance officer, your management tier, anyone who's looking at data at aggregate, right? How I failed, the kinds of resources I tested, even regionally per cloud region that I might use, how I did compared to my overall average. These are the kinds of info points you get in the first half of the compliance assessment. In the second half, you really have the information that your team of practitioners will use to go solve problems. And we'll talk about how we can tie automatic remediation to some of this. But this is the kind of information that your GRC teams, your security operations folks, when there's a deviation that happens in your security posture, this is where you'll find it, right? So, we wrote a rule with some specificity earlier around not allowing, broad traffic into such a sensitive service as SSH. Well, this rule also exists as part of the PCI bundle we ran, and you can see out of 238 security groups tested, 13 didn't comply or failed. And so it's these 13 here that failed. And so now I have a list of security groups that I have to triage to understand why they have this overly permissive SSH rule. I can click on each one of these and get more information on them. But of course, in a more automated CI/CD driven kind of process, I'll be getting this information back via the API, right? So I'll get a list of failed entities, for example, and then I'll either have to fail the process at this point. If this was a rule that was important to me, I would fail that process. I would send this back to that security peer review process to say, hey, your infrastructure as code, your intent, if you will, had some problems. Did not follow our organizational mandate from an IT perspective around security. So, and here's how it failed, right? In this case, these 13 security groups made a reference to a sensitive protocol in a very broad access kind of fashion. And so they'd go back and they'd iterate through that process, and they would keep sending it through to Dome9 compliance until we got the green check mark and everything was deemed good to go. So, whether you do your assessment via API and you gather the results that way, or you do it interactively, it's going to show up in the assessment history. Assessment history within Dome9 is your ledger of every compliance run that takes place. And it doesn't matter if it's triggered by an ad hoc assessment like you saw me do now, the API in an ad hoc way, or the DOM 9 continuous compliance feature set. So continuous compliance is the ability to take any given compliance bundle against any combination of cloud accounts you have connected to DOM 9, and then set it to be continuously assessed. And one of the things that I think that the folks looking at DOM 9 in terms of security automation really like is the ability to get notifications when resources drift in or out of compliance, right? So we can publish via an AWS SNS topic a notification every time that happens. So let's say I have an S3 bucket that I've written rules to ensure that it never becomes globally sort of anonymously accessible. Let's say somebody out of convenience, and we've seen a ton of these happen, even from very security-focused organizations like the NSA. We've seen this happen this year, whereby somebody, presumably out of convenience, opens up an S3 bucket publicly, and somebody or something forgets to, once that work is done, forgets to move it back to the configuration it always should be. Well, DOM 9 won't forget, and the ability to, understand at the minute it happens when, for example, an S3 bucket becomes publicly anonymously accessible, would be published to this AWS SNS topic. You would route that to your SIM tool or any other kind of automation friendly tool set that you've got. Maybe open up a Jira ticket or a service ticket, and have that corrected. And again, we will talk about how you can do some automatic remediation of these very dangerous kinds of configurations that you can get into in a moment. So whether it happens via continuous compliance, the DOM 9 API, or an ad hoc interactive assessment via the portal, you will find kind of the a record that it's been run, and even the results here. But I can go back historically into any previous compliance run, dig out the results, and understand a little bit better what happened and really where I need to work on closing those gaps. And compliance can judge a lot more than the network security side, right? When you looked at Clarity, it is a network security group focused kind of tool set. Compliance is really set on judging a lot more than just network security. It does that too. So as you saw, we had a rule that had to do with broad access to a service like SSH, and you'll find those under the security group validation type. But so too, you'll find things like the rule I suggested around public S3 buckets. In fact, we have a much deeper S3 bucket specific rule bundle that measures all sorts of things. Are you mandating encryption in your S3 buckets? Are you mandating both kind of in transit and at rest? Are you do you have versioning turned on? Are you mandating MFA delete? All sorts of bucket policy kinds of attributes that you can use over on the AWS side, you can measure with DOM 9 as well. So often this is, like we talked about Clarity being used early in the CI/CD process, this is often close to the last stop, right? And you'll typically use this in two ways. One, you'll upload your CFT, you'll judge that, you'll get the results back by API, you'll make a decision whether it's pass or failure based on those results, and then you'll move to provisioning. Once you provision it, either in production or in your staging environment, depends on your process, you'll then do one final assessment with the compliance engine, but this time not against the CloudFormation template, you'll do it against a live environment. And the idea is that those two measurements, if there's been no failures, should give you the exact same result, right? So in code, in the automation, you will likely take the results from the CFT assessment, you'll take the results from the live assessment, and you'll compare those as a final judgment. And if those compare, then you're good to go, and you can rest assured that what's been provisioned has been judged, meets the organizational security posture that your IT organization mandates. And now all you're left with doing is making sure that that gets continuously monitored in just the same fashion against the same standards that you use to measure your CFT and your initial deployment. You want to make sure that, of course, nothing can sneak in terms of configuration that may unintentionally expose your data. And we've already buried the lead a little bit by looking at this earlier, but for that we really lean on this notion of continuous compliance, right? Being able to say, okay, I want my any given bundle, in this case it's CIS, and I want it run against any number of accounts. In this case, it's both my prod and stage. Again, customers in the wild using Dome 9 typically have, many, especially our enterprise customers, have many AWS accounts. So being able to set, one compliance policy against as many of those accounts as you have and need, and different policies for different accounts, right? You may judge your staging account that never has any production data in it a little bit differently than your production account, and you can do that by creating more than one continuous compliance policy. And each one has their own notification options, right? For something that is less sensitive, you may just say, give me a report every day. I just want to know day after day if anything's changing. That level of notification is sufficient. Versus something where, you want to be very, very confident that if something slips in configuration, here you have either PII or just even real life data. You want to make sure that your response to security events in this context are a lot more swift or a lot more comprehensive than maybe in dev staging, where your tolerance for quick changes is a little bit less. So the ability to get very customized over notifications is there within continuous compliance as well. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about dynamic access leasing. This is the capability that will allow you to keep network service ports closed and only open them as you are for the topic of discussion here today around continuous integration and continuous delivery. As you're pushing software, maybe through to hosted databases, maybe you're making changes, maybe you're pushing it to at an instance level, software on machines, for example. As you're pushing software, you may need to open up network ports to allow that to happen. And again, what we don't want you to do is keep those ports open full-time for a process that you may be only exercising, once every couple of weeks. The idea is to keep that network port closed and then come to Dome 9 when you need access. And I'll show you the interactive way to do this, but just know that this is also very consumable via API. We often position this feature around the use by staff, by contractors, getting access to a service that is maybe seldom used, but it's equally appropriate for processes, whereby if I want to push a software to a host governed by SSH, I keep that port closed, so that means there's no general attack surface associated with that at all. Yet when I need to push software, I make an API call to Dome 9 Dynamic Access Leasing. It opens up that port for me either in an auto-detected IP kind of way, or if I do this in a slightly different means back here, I have more flexibility, right? I can create a custom lease where I specify the IP myself, for example, and I include some justification that makes its way to the Dome 9 audit trail, which I'll show you next. So, in this way, if I do this via API, I can open up this network port, I can push my software with any kind of tool set, right, like a Jenkins or an Atlassian Bamboo that's part of my CI/CD testing sort of pipeline. Now I can successfully push that software. When I'm done, I can cancel my lease and rest assured that that port will not remain open, forever, creating that potential attack surface from others. So dynamic access leasing is very, very strategic for that, and again, is consumable by API. So I think with that, I'm going to stop. I think we have some questions here. Thelen, what do we have in the way of questions that have come in?
Sure. So Patrick, the first question we have is, which features of Dome 9 are available via API versus those that are not?
That is a great question. I think I talked a little bit about that, but Clarity, just by nature of the tool it is not, right? As you see, the value of Clarity comes from sitting in front of it, either uploading that CFT for that perspective or picking a live environment and then interactively kind of working with the tool. You may have noticed as I was clicking through the security groups, right, I can explore where traffic's permitted to flow in, where it's permitted to flow out. So Clarity is the single capability within Dome 9 that is not API accessible. Everything else is the compliance engine is, dynamic access leasing is, gathering information out of the audit trail is. I kind of promised you I'd show you that, so maybe I'll bring it up the screen as we talk. So I think to answer that question very directly, Clarity is not. Every other DOM 9 feature is.
Okay. We have another question. Second one, can DOM 9 integrate with Slack? We use Slack to keep tabs on automated activities.
Yeah, I think this is a popular use case we've seen more and more, whether it's Slack or another similar kind of tool. Looking at the output of your automation processes, for example, piping that to a Slack channel for review, I think is become a popular tool and a popular strategy. So DOM 9 absolutely can. We do not have, some technology companies have this concept of kind of a plug-in marketplace. That is emerging at DOM 9. You're going to see that over time, probably the second quarter of next year. But we do have some pre-canned integrations that we've done for, or have assisted our customers to do over time. Slack is one of them. Jira is another. Splunk is a very popular one. There actually is a DOM 9 connector built for Splunk itself. So contact us, support@dom9.com, for whatever you're looking to integrate with. And we likely have some experience. Next year you'll see kind of an even more well-defined story, if you will, for off-the-shelf integrations as well.
Okay. We have another question. And it is, can I provision a user in DOM 9 that only has access to dynamic access leasing and nothing else?
Yeah, you absolutely can. We did not spend a lot of time on the role-based access system within DOM 9, but if I build a role, and let's just call it our test webinar role, and you'll see that there are several different vectors of permission. If I just configure this one and I say, okay, you're allowed to consume dynamic access leases within whatever scope, maybe it's a whole account, maybe it's something on a specific security group within a specific VPC, within a specific account, I can get that narrow as well. If I do this and assign no other permissions, when you log in, you will only see the dynamic access top menu item and nothing else. So DOM 9 is kind of contextual that way. We will only display to you in a menu kind of, potential click kind of path what you have access for. And in fact, that's the case with dynamic access leasing. That would be the only menu item you have. So if you have a particular account that's only got access for dynamic access leasing, you can either use it interactively or by API call that. And just know that that DOM 9 account has no ability to do, to affect any other change outside of that.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Next one, how does DOM 9 access the AWS account?
Great question. Again, something that we kind of took for granted as our limited time affords us here. But as you add an account, you have a choice. You can use DOM 9 in a read-only mode, where we inform you on things like security group changes. You can use tools like Clarity, which of course are read-only, even compliance assessments, but you can't use tools like dynamic access leasing, which actually make changes to your firewall state. Right? For that you need read-write protection. But either mode you choose, we basically guide you through the process. You're going to create an AWS role and an AWS policy. You're going to attach that policy to that role, and then DOM 9 is going to use that role in a cross-account kind of way, very similar to how you assume role within AWS, if you're familiar with that access paradigm. And then from that point on, we understand exactly what we need to in terms of cloud configuration for you to be able to start monitoring and reporting on changes to your config. And so we do not ask you for credential exchanges, and the reason for that is that you're going to build a policy document that's very specific. No root level kind of account. We ask you for exactly what you need, and as you can see, or what we need rather, and as you can see, it's a bunch of log reads, understanding your Lambda functions, understanding what's in your CloudTrail logging, understanding information about your S3 buckets, and that sort of thing. So, heaven forbid if you ever fall out of love with DOM 9, you delete that role and policy, and DOM 9 no longer has access into any perspective of your account at all.
Okay. Another question. Can Dome 9 explore into OS configurations?
Great question. Without an agent, Dome 9 does not have access to your data on your machines. Now, having said that, we are in the midst of integrating with a service called AWS Inspector, if you're familiar with that. Inspector does have an agent that sits in your workloads and that measures things like, what's running in memory, what versions of software you have installed, which patch level you have installed, common OS configurations, is your root user enabled? Can you log in as root, for example, in an effort to get down to that host level visibility. So although Dome 9 does not have a proprietary kind of agent perspective on intra-machine information, we are beginning to leverage AWS Inspector, which does. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You'll still remain completely API integrated into AWS, which has a lot of advantages, security at scale being probably the most obvious one, but still gain that host level intelligence. So that's coming very soon. You'll see some inspector related information within compliance and governance already. And if you're looking at a machine within protected assets that has an inspector agent on it, you'll have a dedicated kind of inspector tab. I doubt I have one right at hand. I don't, but right across here you'll have an inspector tab with a bunch of inspector specific information. So very soon you'll be able to write compliance rules that have to do with host level attributes, which is very, very exciting for us.
Great. Another question. Is this a pure SaaS solution, or can you deploy this into an account controlled by the customer?
So Dome 9 is a SaaS solution entirely, but there is a mode of sort of control, and I don't know if this question is kind of the underlying intent is more control maybe than a SaaS solution delivers. There is a way to use Dome 9 in read-only mode where you're not giving Dome 9 any kind of write privilege, yet you want to do some automatic remediation. And so we have an open source project called Cloud Supervisor, and it's located at GitHub. Just a quick Google for Dome 9 Cloud Supervisor and you'll find the link. And this is a Lambda function that you'll upload into your own account. And it leverages the Dome 9 API to do an assessment via the compliance engine, brings back the failures, and then allows you to do some automatic remediation based on those failures. And in the project we have things, actions like stop instance, create tags, send a custom notification. We even have a quarantine user that's coming soon as well. And this allows you to have kind of the ability to use Dome 9 in a read-only fashion, but to affect change based on the results coming from the compliance engine in your own credentialed environment, right? So it's kind of a nice hybrid of using a hosted solution in a non-threatening way, in a read-only way, but still being able to affect change all within your own credentialed AWS account. So this is quite a popular method for doing automatic remediation based on what the compliance engine finds. But to answer your question directly, it is only delivered as software as a service.
Okay. Another question we have here. Recently, I've seen a lot of discussion about embedding declarative security specifications into infrastructure as code, call it a MetaCFT, and then running a preprocessor on that MetaCFT to use the security declarations to produce pure CFT with necessary infrastructure to implement the declared security. Is Dome 9 working towards anything like that?
Not quite. I mean, I think what we're embarking on, I think, next within infrastructure as code is probably support for more than just CFT. And there's no promises here. This is something that's in the labs and that we're working on trying to understand better. But where we're headed, I think, is, whether it's Terraform or another kind of way, a more cloud-independent way of describing that intent. I think that's where we're headed next. Maybe after we have that support that we're interested in and our customers are interested in, maybe that kind of sort of meta, higher level description, with the result being a tactical CFD or a tactical Terraform, maybe that's something we could look at. But today it's kind of explicit CFTs directly.
Okay, a few more. Do you integrate with Google GCP Deployment Manager?
We do not out of the box, no.
And the last one, What if I don't use CloudFormation in AWS? In our case, we leverage Ansible Playbooks. Would Dome9 integrate into that workflow?
Dome9 certainly can, but I think Ansible Playbooks are a little bit different than kind of the intent of a CFT, right? The CFT, across as many services as it supports, is really your statement of intent. I think an Ansible Playbook is slightly different, but there's no reason that we could not integrate with what a playbook provisions, of course. With the intent, we're trying to measure kind of the state of a playbook before you do provision, I think might be challenging. I think it goes back to what we talked about with, Dome9 looking to support more than just CFT as a syntax. But again, I think that a CFT and an Ansible playbook are probably slightly different in even what they attempt to do. So we'd have to look a little bit deeper there. But I think those kinds of problems are certainly on our minds.
Okay, all right. Well, that was all the questions. Thank you, Patrick. All right, everyone, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the email q&anda@dome9.com. I have a few final notes. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today and would like to experience the Dome9 ARC platform for yourself, we are offering a more detailed personal demo for your team or a 14-day free trial. Please visit our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our homepage. At the very bottom of the page, you'll see that. Just register and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to schedule a demo or activate your free trial. Additionally, if you liked the webinar today and would like to hear more about the multi-cloud security solutions Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for several of our upcoming webinars, or go to www.dome9.com/webinars. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please contact us through our website and let us know. With that, we thank you for your time today and hope you found the content informative. This now concludes the Dome9 webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.